Welcome, everyone, to Fasken's 14th consecutive mining series. My name is Virginia Schweitzer, and I'm part of the Fasken Global Mining Group, and also the co-managing partner of Fasken's Ottawa office. Today, we have a very exciting webinar, Artificial Intelligence, Human Resources, and Other Legal Issues, which is the third in our series of 14 seminars this year. A calendar of all of Fasken's PDAC events can be found underneath the video window. Please refer to the slide on your screen for some housekeeping items. Now I will turn it over to my colleagues Alix from our Toronto office and Stéphane Fillion from our Montreal office, both of whom are partners in our Labor and Employment and Human Rights Group.
Thanks, Virginia, and welcome everyone. Hello to my fellow partner in crime, Stéphane. I can assure you he is not a fake. He is a real human live person. So we're going to get into AI today. And if we move to the next slide, we'll look at the agenda for today's materials. We're going to talk briefly about what do we mean by artificial intelligence. We want to look at, obviously, AI in the context of human resources and how that impacts both on employers and employees. And when we talked about the other legal issues, we're going to be talking about, in particular, constructive dismissal claims, human rights issues that can arise with AI, privacy, intellectual property, and some negligence. We're going to talk at some best practices and some possible solutions for employers when we look at some of the impacts of AI on our work environment. At any time, please don't hesitate to let us know if you have any questions by using the chat. And not ChatGPT, just our chat. So let's get started. If we move to the next slide and the next slide. When we talk about the evolution of AI, and I mean, this is obviously something we've all learned about over the last, I'd say, 12 months as we really try to get a handle on what we mean by artificial intelligence. And today we're really addressing two different concepts. The reliance on AI by our employees in our work environment, like ChatGPT, and we're also looking at the solutions that you as an organization can develop in-house or purchase. Think of the AI that you feed yourself and how those models can benefit your work environment. And then we'll look at the legal impacts. When we look at how AI has evolved over the decades, we started obviously with machine learning, which is really how machines can automatically adapt with minimum human intervention. And because I'm someone who likes examples, I went and looked for some. And some of the examples are like when you get those messages from your bank saying that there's a credit card fraud detection on your bank account, or there's some social media connections that have been made. And these machine learnings then have evolved, in a subset of that machine learning is deep learning. And we talk about deep learning as artificial neural networks, which try to mimic the learning of the learning process of the human brain. So when we think about practical applications of AI in this context, we think about Google Translate, we think about facial recognition on Facebook. And what I've discovered is that includes the IBM Watson that won the Jeopardy show in 2011. Now, part of the deep learning is obviously has evolved into natural learning processing, which is a particular way of processing, which is basically teaching machines to understand and interpret human language. And that by that, we mean translation and voice recognition. Hello, Siri. And who doesn't live without Siri these days? And obviously, these language processings can kind of fall into a lot of the AI models that we're going to talk about today. And then we've obviously evolved into these large language models. And the large language models are really large, deep learning models that basically are pre-trained on vast amounts of data and are really text-based. And that's when we think about models like ChatGPT or Gemini, which is the new Google version of that. When we think about large language models, we're really thinking about the text modeling. And when we talk about generative AI, we're really talking about not only the ability to generate new and unique text, but also images, music, code, in any other types of content that is not just limited to text. And obviously, we use these types of AI as a way to research, summarize documents, generate new ideas, writing, saying happy birthday to one of your family members and having them draft a lovely happy birthday to you. When we think about like neural language processing, we're really thinking about Dua Lipa, like DALL-E 2, which is art and image generation. So we can start to see how there are all these different ways of AI modeling impacting our various parts of our lives and how that actually can impact on our organizations. So when we talk about the current use of generative AI or AI in our organizations, we're really talking about it from the perspective of the employees and how they're using it. And we know that a lot of employees are using it in the context of ChatGPT. So I thought it would be interesting to just look at a brief study that KPMG did towards the end of last year. And they determined out of a study, I think, of about 5,200 participants, that 1 in 5 Canadians are using AI tools for work and or school. And these obviously include what we talked about, researching, drafting documents, summarizing documents, and creating presentations. What I found interesting was that the survey shows amongst those AI users, 23% of them are working professionals who say they are entering information about their employer, including the employer name, into the prompts. And some are even putting financial data, that was 10% of people, or other proprietary information such as human resources or supply chain data into their prompts. That was another 15%. What also came out of the study was that you would think when you're using a new tool that people would be concerned about the accuracy of the actual AI that they're relying on. And they determined that only half of the participants checked the data for accuracy, whereas another 50% of people only checked it sometimes. And what we have determined, as we all know, based on the case, what we've seen on TV and what we've read in the papers, is generative AI platforms have been known to produce content that is misleading or inaccurate. And that is often what we call hallucinations. And even though the participants were asked the question about hallucinations and the fact that the participants were told about the hallucinations, they were concerned about the accuracy of the information, but it wouldn't stop them from actually using it. So I think what we can take from that is people are going to use it, whether they're accurate or not. And as organizations, we're going to need to look at that and figure out how we control for that in our work environment. And I found that interesting because yesterday I read an article about a US law firm in New York where the law firm cited ChatGPT to justify its bid for legal fees against the New York Department of Education. And they used it to cross-check to back up their billing rate that they included in their fee request to the court. And the judge here not only mentioned prior cases, which some of us may have read, where a lawyer was admonished for relying on inaccuracies and fictitious case law that they obtained out of ChatGPT. But again, here in this case, they found that the use of ChatGPT for the law firm's aggressive bid on the fees is utterly and unusually unpersuasive. So note to all lawyers on the phone, we do not want to use ChatGPT as a justification for our legal position, including for fees. And in the end of the day, in that court case, the judge awarded half of what they were requesting. So we know that data is obviously the most important and valuable asset a company can have. We know that our employees are using these generative AI models in their work environment. So I wanted to turn briefly to, well, what are the employers doing in terms of how are they using AI models? And the Harvard Business Review has determined that companies primarily use AI for 4 distinct areas. One is to detect and deter security intrusions, troubleshoot user technology issues, reduce production management tasks, and assess internal compliance when using approved vendors. So those all make sense to us, and we have known that's been happening for some time. What is interesting, and what I'm curious about our audience here today, is that when we look at it in particular relation to human resources, we do see that there are lots of AI models that are being developed and are currently being used to improve employee recruitment, selection and training processes, to sort resumes and applications, and to help identify skill gaps and training plans. And so we know that from an employer perspective, many organizations feel that AI models can make informed decisions about some of these elements of human resources, recruiting, training, and talent management. And when you think about how much time your organization spends on recruitment and reviewing resumes, this could obviously be an area that companies look to become more efficient in their recruitment. So if we move to the next slide, I'd ask you, if you don't mind, putting in the chat, are you and your organization using AI? Have you taken any steps to study AI, to study AI adoption and its risks? And do you track the use of new AI like ChatGPT in your organization? So let us hear from that. We'll take that into account as we move through our presentation. And I'm going to turn it over to my not fake friend, Stéphane, who's going to talk about HR and the impact of AI on employers and employees.
So, as you said, the not fake Stéphane will now take over, but do you really know if I'm not fake? So it's all the issue about AI, as we will see in the next few sections. Do you really know what is happening there and where it's coming from? So anyway, so just coming back to my slide, the next one, please. As we will see in the next sections, the possibilities are potentially limitless, but it obviously depends on what you feed the AI and what you use it for. But it also limits, as we will see, to what AI can do. And depending on your organization's values, AI might not be able to adequately take it into account, or at least not take everything into account. Next slide. There are obviously a lot of potential advantages to the introduction of AI in the workplace, but as we will see, these advantages can also lead to potential issues. But let's start with the advantages. First one is the automation of repetitive and routine tasks. There are several elements we can think of. For example, data entry, document classification, and one of probably the one we prefer all is the customer relationship management. This can be beneficial in a number of ways, especially in the context of manpower shortage as we're experiencing right now. It obviously helps free up time for employees to focus on higher value tasks. It also potentially renders the work more interesting and more challenging for employees. And obviously, it allows us to do more with less. It also can improve accuracy and speed. And what do we mean by that? It means not only delivering answers more quickly, but also being able to consider much more information before making a decision. You're probably in your organizations having sometimes to take decisions, and you're provided with lots and lots and lots of information, but sometimes too much information is really just too much because there's not enough time in a given day, and you have to kind of take shortcuts and only consider part of the information you're provided. But what if, because of AI, you could be able to consider everything that is provided to you to make the most informed decisions? Obviously, that's one of the potential added value of AI. In other words, you can add layers of verifications and considerations before taking a decision, knowing that it will not take a ton of time to do so. It can also be used to predict customer behaviors. And this is the one I was kind of half joking earlier on, probably one that we've all experienced at one point or another. It's basically the AI analyzing customer data and predicting future behavior, allowing businesses to better understand their customers' needs and expectations. This can, in theory, improve customer satisfaction and increase loyalty, but it can also obviously increase sales. This is what you experience when, after searching the internet, for example, for cars, watches, dresses, as an example, suddenly your Facebook and many other sites become flooded with tons of ads on the exact same elements that you just searched for. And this can continue on, as you've probably experienced, for quite some time, for several days and maybe sometimes several weeks. It can also be how companies like Netflix, for example, can recommend TV series or movies that you might like by analyzing your history of what you've watched in the recent period of time. I'm sure if you think about it, because this is just sometimes it's annoying, but if you think about it from the perspective of your organization, there's certainly something you could do to not only to improve your relation with clients and your understanding of your customers' needs, but perhaps even if we take it from an HR standpoint, better understand what candidates are looking for in a position, and maybe you can it can help you position your organization as an employer of choice where employees really want to apply. Last but not least, obviously, is lower the cost. Obviously, because behind most of these aspects, there is a potential reduction in labor costs and an optimization of production processes, which can help increase productivity and efficiency. This is the hope, at least. Once the training has been given to employees to learn how to use it, it obviously depends on the cost of the technology, which I don't know how many of you have started looking into this, but can be quite expensive. And I'm not counting here the cost of implementation, the training for all of the employees, perhaps dealing with employees who will have difficulty adapting to it, putting in place some policies, as we will talk later on. But obviously, I think at this point, it is inevitable an organization will have to implement it sooner or later to avoid competitors gaining an important advantage over them. Next slide. Now let's focus more now on the working conditions and how AI can impact this aspect of the of HR. So among other things, looking at working conditions, AI offers the possibility to eliminate some of the inherent subjectivity in HR and also help manage bonuses, benefits, and even payroll with tracking technology that links back to actual employee output. Something a supervisor would be unable to do if he was at the same time doing his job, or it would require him too much time to really be able to do. So you may ask yourself, Stéphane, how can AI help better manage bonuses and benefits, as an example? Well, unlike subjective assessments, which can be biased or influenced by external factors, AI uses hard data, such as quantity and quality of work performed, projected results, goals achieved, and key performance indicators. In most organizations, there are two limitations to what we can do. First one being tracking more data. So in other words, access to data. Second one, even if you are able to track this data, be able to analyze it in a reasonable delay. If you provide your supervisors with a list of 20 KPI, how can you really expect them to go through all of them and be able to really work it out? They will likely do, as most organizations do, focus on a couple of them and probably leave aside a certain number of other elements that could have been relevant in analyzing the performance of the employee. This inevitably leads to preferring certain data over others and including information that could provide a better picture of the employee's performance. So using AI in bonus and benefits management can help establish clear and objective evaluation criteria for all employees. And this can ensure that bonuses and benefits are distributed fairly and that employees are rewarded based on their actual performance rather than the subjective perception of their work. In preparation for this webinar, I even asked AI to provide KPI for different jobs, and it was actually quite impressive. I'll give you an example just so you can have an idea. So I asked the AI to provide me with KPI that could be considered for maintenance employees as an example, and it came back with the following: work order completion rate, equipment downtime, preventive maintenance compliance, mean time to repair, response time, inventory management, and many more. So in other words, it's still amazing to see what it can do. And jokes aside, I even did it for lawyers as well. But if you allow me, I will keep it for myself at this point. But more than just managing bonuses, the same tool can help identify employees who need additional training or development to improve their performance and thus contribute to business success. So as a result, by using AI to track the actual employee output, companies can also gain a better understanding of their workforce productivity and efficiency. And data collected by AI can help identify trends and patterns in employee behavior, which can help optimize work processes, reduce cost, and improve the quality of work. Additionally, using AI to track employee outputs can also help identify instances where employees are working too long or are overloaded. We've all known in organizations that we're now focusing more and more on the importance of mental health in the workplace. So again, this tool can be used as well to be able to have some kind of trigger to let us know that maybe something is not going well. In sum, the use of AI in the management of bonuses, benefits, salaries, and performance can help companies make more informed and objective decisions regarding employee compensation. It can also help improve fairness, transparency, and employee satisfaction, which in turn can contribute to employee retention and bonus success. Because most of the time in organizations, you'll have employee complain about the fact that since it's a human making the decision, there's always some kind of subjectivity involved. Obviously, it's all a question of what you feed the system with in terms of data. So far, I believe most employers are being very, very careful with all of the leaks we have seen. Most employers that I know have been reluctant to feed the AI with any sorts of confidential employee data, but there's certainly potential in what I mentioned here. But there are, unfortunately, things the AI cannot do and will never be able to do. And this concerns mostly what are considered intangible factors. As an example, you could have an employee who objectively performs less than colleagues if you're just talking about, for example, hours or outputs or stuff like that. But at the same time is the person to whom everyone turns when they need informal advice, who gets involved in tasks that do not have an impact that can be measured or assessed financially, but helps, for example, it could be someone who helps coordinate the work of colleague, or someone who is a specialist who intervenes in correcting certain aspect. The employee could be a true leader in the workplace and contribute to a healthy team spirit and thereby bring value to the company. However, obviously, there's no way you can objectivize this. And as a result, it's very hard to imagine that AI could be taking this into consideration for purposes, for example, of remuneration. Turning now to the next one on this slide, it's the famous robo-boss, which I heard for the first time when I started preparing for this conference. No, it is not the type of boss that you see on the picture here sitting near a desk. Robo-boss is actually an informal term used to describe the use of automation and artificial intelligence to oversee, manage, and evaluate the performance of employees in a business. Unlike a traditional human manager, a robo-boss uses obviously algorithm and data to make human resource management decisions such as hiring, promotion, salary increases, scheduling, and task management. At least that's the theory. And you might ask yourself, as an example, where can I find such a robo-boss? Well, setups in which robots act autonomously, like employers or managers, are not yet possible due to the state of the art and the legal framework. And even in terms of developments at this stage, they do not like what you, as I mentioned, like what you see in the picture. However, there are still already some applications that maybe you've never heard about. And this is one thing that I clicked on, when Alix was mentioning at the beginning, the number of people who use AI, in either in studies or in work. The good question would be, how many of them didn't know they were using AI actually when they were performing these tasks? And that might be actually a part of it. So basically, for the moment, what we're talking about when we're talking about robo-boss is basically robots that can help you perform tasks that generally would have been done by managers. And actually, when I started thinking about it, I know I've seen some applications in some workplace. This could be, for example, and I'm just giving you a few examples. It could be the assignment of overtime, for example. I know companies right now who hire subcontractors who will basically apply the rules that might be set up in a collective agreement or handle all the calls that are being made to employees to see if they would be available to come in to work overtime. But there are more and more companies now moving to a system that is either based on an application on your phone or it's based on a text application where basically employees are texted directly and asked if they could perform overtime. That's the type of task that a computer or a robot like that could be handling. It could also manage employees who are on call or employees that you need to call in because others are absent from work. But it could go even further than that, as we will see in some of the applications we've found. Could talk about assignment of tasks. Robo-bosses could, for example, use the data that they've been fed to assign the right employees to the right task, taking into account what they're best at. We obviously at an early stage, but gradually we're starting to see applications in the workplace, and it's certainly a great tool to assist managers and supervisors in doing their jobs. And we know these days how difficult it could be to find supervisors. Next slide. So there could also obviously be negative impacts of AI on employers and employees, and they're kind of the counterbalance to what I've mentioned in terms of the benefits. So first, on working conditions, artificial intelligence to a certain extent, while it can bring competitive advantages and increase productivity, also leads to excessive surveillance of workers in most of the time, invasion of their privacy, and kind of a submission to the platform. Because in order to collect data, to a certain extent, you're spying on employees and looking at basically their every moves and what they do. For example, you would never see a supervisor continually following an employee to see how much time he goes to the bathroom, how fast he performs some of his tasks, how fast he or she types on a computer, and so on. But with increased use of AI, we might come to this, or some may say we've already come to this to a certain extent. Also, algorithms can create high dependency to data, kind of like having managers who forget that they can also make calls and basically always relying on whatever info is fed to them by AI. Especially based on what we typically call the automation bias, which is basically that given that it's coming from a computer, it must be true, which actually, as we will see later on, is not necessarily the case. And it is easy to see how it could make workers more vulnerable and insecure. Then there's the inevitable impact on stability. I don't know, maybe some of them, especially late 90s, beginning of 2000s experience, it was kind of the time of all the technological changes and all the comments that we heard in the workplaces of employees being extremely worried that they might lose their job and there might be nothing else to do for them. So obviously, I think we'll have a similar thing with AI coming in the workplace. I don't know how it will end up. I was just thinking when I was preparing the presentation that maybe it will reduce staff in certain aspect, but it might actually increase the need for HR in terms of intervention, presentation of this, and kind of just managing employee morale through all of these changes. So. But obviously, it creates, it might make a job less stable and more precarious, which obviously will raise questions about the quality of employment and the security of the employment relationship. This led, as I mentioned earlier on, to a lot of fear in the 90s and the beginning of 2000s. So we might start seeing in some workplaces provisions appear in collective agreements and so on. There's even legislation now being developed, and it will be interesting to see where it will eventually involve. Sorry, and this is also taking into account that some employees, whose tasks are more technical, could ultimately be replaced by AI. And, we might ask ourselves, what about employees who will be unable to use AI, which was, again, another issue at the end of the 90s. Automation of tasks and unbundling of tasks. What we mean by that is AI, has a tendency to reduce a job to a series of tasks and individualize them. So basically making it into very, very small separate tasks, which can lead to a tendency by employers to increase the number of temporary or contract workers by kind of excluding these tasks from the general work of their employees. This will obviously have an impact on employee turnover and motivation. I would add the impact on the feeling of accomplishment when employees are reduced to basically the accomplishment of very, very specific tasks that are analyzed by AI. And finally, and unfortunately, we kind of have to mention it, the potential for mistakes by design, if I want to use a term that is pretty light, as a result of frustration, remembering that AI is only as good as the information and that you feed it. Next slide. So for now, I've been talking about very kind of general examples, but I wanted to kind of leave you with a couple of concrete one. First one is Itachi, and to be honest, I will just talk about one of them. But if you look on the internet, it's extremely interesting to read about how much this company has done in terms of AI, not only in their own workplaces, but also to find tools for everything. There's even attempts based on AI by Itachi to cure cancer, as an example. So it goes extremely far. I hope they're going to be successful in that one. So first example, so basically they've started developing an AI system that assigns work tasks. So what I was mentioning earlier on, and I haven't seen it in Canada, to be honest, but they're actually working on it. It's based on an analysis of data and past work sequences. This method aims to perfect and speed up work sequences. For example, the system basically is continuously optimizing the making up of the work. The AI program that they're working on also allows robots to give instructions to workers, for example, to issue orders. When I mean orders is, as an example, for maintenance and other stuff like that. Then there's IBM that has implemented, and it's kind of funny because they're still using the same name as the one who won Jeopardy, but they also have the Watson Talent Frameworks, which uses AI to identify the skills and qualification required for open position and to evaluate employees against these criteria. And it allows IBM to objectively assess employee performance and identify skill gaps to determine training and development. And it is also, and I don't know how, to be honest, don't ask me how it does it, but IBM uses this AI to predict employee who might be at risk of leaving the company, allowing them to take steps to retain those employees by offering additional benefits or offering them new challenges, for example. Unilever, in this case, they're using it in the recruitment process by using AI for resume analysis and candidate screening. Unilever was able to reduce the time spent on the recruitment process by about 75%, and it also allowed them to increase the diversity of its hires. And you can easily understand that even in our field, where you receive, as an example, 100 CVs for a position, there's no way you could just analyze all of them. So you're probably going to take a couple of criteria to at least make a first scan and remove a lot of them. But if you're using AI, obviously you don't necessarily have to throw all of these resume aside. Then there's the Textio platform, which is certainly something that will be in vogue. It's basically a writing platform that uses artificial intelligence to improve the quality and inclusiveness of tasks. It's pretty amazing, actually. You just write down, it could even be an email, and basically if you're being kind of I call it aggressive in your email, it will suggest words that are more inclusive and that would basically go smoother. But what we're referring to here is the use for drafting, actually, job application. So the platform not only produces more inclusive job descriptions or job posting, but it also analyzes the result of these job posting, and it can measure the impact of the inclusiveness on the text. It also offer analysis tool to help companies understand how their language may affect their target. And just to give an example of known users of this technology, it includes basically university, government agencies, Microsoft, Johnson & Johnson, and NVIDIA. So it's as you can see, it's pretty extensive. So I'll turn it over to you, Alix. Oh no, yes.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Unmuting myself. Maybe AI will eventually unmute us before we need to unmute ourselves. That would be great. Okay, if we move to the next slide, we're going to start talking about some of the key legal issues that arise with the use of AI. And if we go to the next slide, you'll see a summary of our first one. So we're going to look at constructive dismissal issues. And it was interesting because I saw a lot on the chat that people were saying that they don't really use it. There's not a lot of policies. One person has a general policy, but nothing discrete. And so I was interested in hearing that, because when you think about what people are saying about AI and how rapidly it is growing and evolving, one of the big concerns that we should all have as employers is really, what is that going to do for our workers, for our complement of workers? And so we looked at a recent McKinsey poll, And they basically said that they think around 5%. I've seen other studies that go as high as 9% that say that as a result of AI and the use of AI in the workplace, we could see as many as 5 to 10% of jobs actually removed from the work environment. And obviously, that would result in a whole bunch of ethical issues, which we won't get into today, but it will result in obviously a lot of terminations and employee morale issues in the work environment. But what I think is even more significant for employers to think about is really how the use of AI can change the content of what employees are doing. And just as Stéphane was saying, if you automate certain tasks and you then are forced to change the complement of tasks that employees are doing, and they predict in the study that 60% of jobs could have more than 1/3 of their duties and tasks changed as a result of AI. And we think about traditional constructive dismissal law that says if you make fundamental changes to the terms and conditions of employees' employment, that could give rise to constructive dismissal claims. So if we think about how jobs can be rapidly changing, and we all know that employees are not necessarily always agreeable to the velocity of this kind of change, and that change at this kind of degree could really impact employees, we could see a significant rise in constructive dismissal claims. And if we think about, that we want to be proactive before we start using AI to start getting ourselves into a protective mechanism so we can actually start thinking about how can we position the organization to deal with some of those changes in the best way possible, both from an employee culture perspective, but also from a financial perspective. So obviously, certain industries will change quicker than others. And from what I've read, and Stéphane, I know you can agree with me or not, what I saw a lot was the scope of change in transportation, in logistics, in services, in administrative type agencies. Those are going to see significant changes very quickly. I even heard, we've heard in the legal profession, it could be 5 to 10 years, but I think that's changing all the time, and it could be much faster than that. So when we think about changes, one option is obviously to think about planning these AI changes and trying to, incrementally change them, because that's obviously less risky. Employees, if they're faced with smaller changes to their terms and conditions, can usually get their head around that and can adapt to those changes. But really, are we going to be able to do this in this new environment? And so when we think about how we can provide protection for employers, we obviously go to things like contractual protections. And Stéphane can jump in on the Quebec side, but on Ontario and the other jurisdictions in Canada, we obviously look to employment agreements as one way to control the costs at termination. That is not the case in Quebec, and Stéphane can comment on that in a bit. But one of the big things that I always think about is we currently have been through a stage in Ontario where the last 3 or 4 years have been a lot of significant changes in the case law, which has made the majority of offer letters and employment agreements not enforceable. And our clients have been slowly trying to make those changes to get them enforceable. And this would be even more important to do, so that if you do have to terminate people, you have some control on the financial consequences of having to terminate employees. The other obviously great thing is if people are being promoted, when you're dealing with existing employees, you can't just give them a new offer letter or a new employment agreement and think that you can rely on that in a year or two from now. Unless that employee has actually received some new form of consideration, like a signing bonus or an extra day of vacation or something of some consequence, you would not be able to rely on that offer letter or employment agreement. So using offer letters when people are being promoted or there's a change where they're receiving some additional consideration are really important ways for an organization to start to get their employees under enforceable employment agreements. It's also really important to look at your job descriptions, to really look at how you can draft those job descriptions and create enough flexibility in those job descriptions so that you can predict that there will be changes. And obviously in the offer letter, have employees acknowledge that there will be technological changes and that they have agreed to some of those technological changes impacting the tasks that they will be doing over the term of their employment. And having regular acknowledgements and giving notice to employees around how they can understand and see those changes, acknowledge that they're happening. So when we look at collective agreements and in the unionized world, this is, and you mentioned this, Stéphane, this is obviously, I think, going to be important. And I think we've already seen in some of my latest negotiations, and I know Stéphane does a lot of bargaining, so I'd be interested to hear from him. I really think we're going to see a real push on understanding how technological changes will be incorporated into collective agreements. We've always had provisions that say if jobs become redundant or employees are laid off because of technological changes, there's certain notice provisions that are basically triggered. There could be severance and training obligations that also arise that are set out in the collective agreement. And I think we haven't always really looked at those provisions as being significant until there is technological change. And so making sure you understand what's currently in your collective agreement, so you know what you're required to do, and making sure that you understand what you agree to if you go into any bargaining. I don't know, Stéphane, have you seen
So far, we haven't seen much, to be honest, in terms of movement. Most collective agreements already include technological change provision. But I think so far, because of everything that has happened and kind of the fear of everyone of things like ChatGPT, I think it's moving along very, very slowly because people are worried. But I think it's going to be something to keep in mind in the next several years, because I think we're going to see some changes in that regard.
Yeah, so I would predict there will be some increased severance obligations as a result of introduction of AI models and technological change in union environments. One thing to note in the McKinsey study was that 62% of the leaders surveyed in that study believe they will need to replace or reform a quarter of their work environment due to AI models coming into play by the end of this year. To me, that was like a significant change. And so we definitely see that there's going to be changes, and we always have to be careful when we see those changes, that sort of quickness in those changes is how that impacts particular groups of employees. And I think if you had mentioned before certain classifications of employees, and I think of older workers in environments who may not be as adaptable to understanding AI models and the use of technology, that could also give rise to some human rights claims, which leads us to the next slide. Sorry, my link went off. So there we go. In terms of human rights, we really think it's important to think about human rights when you use AI models, because as Stéphane said, there is this idea that if it comes from a machine, somehow it is objective and it's accurate and you can rely on it. And there's almost a tendency by people to just rely on that machine and the result of whatever the AI is telling you, and not to bring the human thinking to it. And that automation bias can be really concerning. But really, what we also see is that artificial intelligence is designed from the data that it's put in. And as we say, garbage in, garbage out. So if you're allowing decisions to be made on a source of data that is not trained or is incomplete or unrepresentative or mislabeled, there could be outcomes that you're not predicting. And we've seen lots of articles and discussions that where you put in data that is not complete and it does not address some of inherent biases that we all have, then you're going to have decisions that could give rise to significant human rights issues. And so, for example, in recruitment systems, right, if you just make decisions based on input that you haven't analyzed and you don't know where that input comes from, the results may be bad. And we think about the Amazon example. They used an AI platform for recruitment. They trained it on different resumes over a 10-year period. And the resumes at the end of the day were mostly men, and therefore the system inherently ignored or downgraded resumes with words that were associated with women, and they end up favoring men. We've also seen examples when we've used AI models to say what is a productive person, and they've generated only male and white responses back. So when you are using these AI models, we have to make sure that you're using models that have understood these biases. And therefore, you always want to have human intervention to ensure that that is being monitored and corrected, and those potential biases are not embedded into your system. And we just have to acknowledge AI is not objective. We think it's objective, but it really is not. And we have to take steps to mitigate bias. And ways that you as an organization, if you're looking at these systems as, to use within your organization, you want to ensure that they're using global diversity data. So you understand that they're using people from different places with different terms, with different ethnicities and different races, that the use of different terminology and languages is included in the data, that you use a diverse set of race, gender, age, education, and experiences in the data that's being used, that you teach the AI about the many jobs and the titles and the roles within your business, and that you audit your systems on a regular basis, because this is where we do see a significant potential for human rights applications or lawsuits. And obviously this could lead to class actions, which, while not huge in Canada, we see a lot of class actions in the US. We've definitely started to see provincial class actions emerging in the last number of years, typically on overtime. But we should see that as a risk here as well. So all in all, I think we have to remember that AI is designed by human beings and therefore reflects our own biases. So if we move to the next slide, when we think about the recruitment process, there's obviously opportunities, and we talked about that at the beginning when we talked about the neutrality of an AI model being able to take a huge number of resumes, take all those tasks, figure out the skills and figure out the gaps, and then find the right candidates for the employer. And it can be more objective, and in some ways it could lead to more diversity if we're using the right AI model. And we've talked now about some of these biases that are underneath there. But what we could also talk about is that these AI models can result in more accessibility to the labor marketplace that we have not seen before for people with disabilities. And it could be a great tool to fight discrimination. We're starting to see Microsoft Seeing AI, which is designed for like the visually impaired. And I took a look at that because I was interested to see like what it's actually developed. And it's an intelligent app that can describe the world around you. So it can actually, by using your phone, describe to the individual what is around them. They can read short text. They can read a printed page. They can narrate text. They can read barcodes. They can describe people around you. And they can also describe facial expressions. They can even tell you what currency you're paying with. So we can see that there is a potential here that could be very positive for people who have lived life with disabilities. And this could be a real tool for employers to have access to these candidates. If we move to the next slide. So when we talked at the beginning, and Stéphane has mentioned that the hiring by algorithms. And obviously there is a risk of discrimination in the classification of applications. So while we can use data and AI to improve equality and diversity, as we've seen in the slide before, in the recruitment process and in how we engage with different classes of employees. And we've seen this with platforms like Stéphane mentioned, Textio. There's also a Head Start, which is another one I looked at, that can help employers meet equality and fairness obligations to candidates. As we've said before, it's really important to look at the data set of the company because you don't know where those inherent potential biases are. So we know that with some of these like Textio, which, as you mentioned, Stéphane, Johnson & Johnson is using. And what I also noted is McDonald's is using in that. And they reported, as well as Johnson & Johnson reported, that they had way more additional female applications. In fact, Johnson & Johnson reported that they had 90,000 additional female applications, which was a 9% increase after implementing Textio. So the ability to use a model that ensures inclusiveness in the language that it's using and the job posting and how it describes things creates an opportunity to appeal to more candidates than you probably would have had before. And obviously, when you're in large organizations, which has large numbers of applications that are coming in, these can create some modeling for you that gives you access to employees, that are more diverse. But we're also obviously concerned that how these models are actually used and how we actually know whether they could result in some discrimination, because there are assumptions that underlie all of these AI models. And we have to be able to know that they exist in order to know that we're not putting ourselves into a position of risks. So, for example, if you've put in data into your AI system that is looking at gaps between employment. So normally, we wouldn't think about that. We'd look at a resume and we'd say, oh, someone's had a gap of a year or whatever, and we would ask them about that in the interview, and we would probably get some assurances around why there is a gap there. Sometimes if you're leaving that to a model, they're just going to look at those gaps and they're going to say, okay, that doesn't have as much experience as other people, but they could be legitimate human rights reasons why there are gaps. Like someone could have had a disability, they could have had family status obligations, they could have been on a parental leave or a maternity leave. And also, we look at things like, where are they geographically located? Sometimes these AI models actually prefer people who are located closer to the business because they feel that will be better for the employee to get to the work environment. But we may be looking at areas where demographics could be producing ethnicity issues, where certain groups of people are living in different areas and therefore excluded by the way the AI model is looking at the distance from the work environment. So there's so many underlying factors that we need to make sure we consider, and that if you are going to use an AI model, that you speak to that provider to make sure that we're really understanding what's underlying it. And we want to think about, because we think about where recruitment is going, and we talked about the robo-boss, Stéphane, and we said, well, there's no robo-boss yet, but one is coming. And what we are seeing are AI models that can actually track and talk to or interview candidates and track their facial expressions. Because now that we have facial recognition technology, we do see that there is an ability to track facial expressions. And what we have seen, there's elements of bias and discrimination that can arise in how AI systems look at particular people's facial expressions and tics, and that could be used against them and give rise to human rights claims as well. So we need to be careful when we're using some of these AI models, even when doing it for the right reason. Next slide, please. So we talked about this briefly. Productivity data does not tell the full story. So Stéphane had mentioned earlier, it's great for ensuring that we increase efficiency and productivity, and those are all very valuable. It's the soft skills that we're not always sure we can track. And Stéphane had mentioned the person that everyone goes to speak to when they have a question, the person who's been there for 15 years and really understands how the business works, the person who trains a lot of the newer employees, whose productivity metrics may not be as strong as some other employees, but it doesn't tell the full story. They could be mentors, coaches, champions, right? So we have to make sure that we don't lose sight of some of these qualitative metrics. And that gives rise to the idea that if we don't focus on some of these other issues, that could also give rise to discrimination issues and human rights complaints. And those are really around, are we really understanding and seeing our employees? Are we able to see whether there are mental health or addiction issues in the work environment? Because you can't forget that human rights legislation in Canada requires employers to inquire. There is an active duty to inquire if you think an employee has a disability that's impacting their work environment. So we cannot lose sight of some of those legal obligations as well. The water cooler discussions become even more important if you're relying solely on some of this productivity data through AI models. Thank you. If we can move to the next slide. We're going to talk briefly about management rights versus privacy rights. and employee monitoring. And I laugh, and I'm sure Stéphane's laughing because, COVID really escalated this to a whole new level. We never really thought about, monitoring how many keystrokes an employee did within a day until they weren't really in the office next to you and you couldn't see them. And so that's obviously become much more prevalent. And we saw a lot of this sort of case law develop in the US. In the Canadian context, we obviously are aware that we have certain jurisdictions that have privacy legislation. At the federal sector, Alberta, BC, and Quebec jurisdictions all have privacy legislation. Jurisdictions like myself in Ontario, we do not have specific privacy legislation, and so the common law governs. But generally what we say is that the federal legislation, our PDAC legislation, those principles are really considered best practice generally. And so whenever we think about why should we be monitoring employees, and Stéphane said earlier, should we be spying on our employees all the time? Do we have a trust with employees? It's always a delicate balancing act between wanting to monitor and ensure we're getting productivity without sort of encroaching on people's privacy. So when I think about employee monitoring, it really serves one primary objective, and that is to make sure employees are doing what they're supposed to be doing. And we can use different devices to do that. So obviously, we have devices that can track when employees log on or log off all their devices. Now, personally, having done a million arbitrations where we want to know if the employee is actually working, I like that particular device where it shows they're logging on and logging off. It's like the clock in, clock out, and those can be very helpful for many cases. But it can go a lot further. It can monitor what websites they're visiting, which is fine. What are they doing during the day? And they can actually track every stroke that the employee makes, including every email, even if it's on their personal email, Gmail or whatever folder that they're writing, you can actually track that. So when we're tracking so much data, we have to be careful that it's really not reaching an employee's expectation of privacy. And that expectation of privacy will really depend on whether you as a company prohibit the use of company devices for personal matters. And like many don't. Many allow employees to use their company-owned cell phone or smartphone for personal reasons. And so are you being clear with employees about what actually is being tracked on the company-owned phone? And how invasive is some of the software that you're using? And really, at the end of the day, you want to make sure that if we are collecting and using and disclosing personal information, that we're doing it in the least intrusive way possible to find that balance between employees' expectations and management rights. And you don't want to inadvertently breach any privacy legislation by going beyond that. And so that really comes down to, do you have informed consent? Have you really looked at your policies and stated what in there the employee's expectation of privacy should be? We always advise, employees should not have an expectation of privacy in their work environment. Don't know what happened to our slide. Hopefully it'll come back. But usually, obviously, we would always recommend that you have a computer usage policy that sets up clear expectations to employees of how your devices will be tracked and used within the work environment. I think we're back. Okay, perfect. Rise of unionization. So, Stéphane, we've generally seen a rise of unionization. I think the US has really helped us with the rise of unionization in the last year. We obviously saw a significant rise in wage rates and terms and conditions of employment in collective agreements in the last year, where we've seen the automotive companies in the US have significant increases in their wages and benefits. And obviously that's trickled down to here. I've been negotiating collective agreements in the last few months, which are considerably different to any other collective agreement that I have bargained in my 22 years of being a labor lawyer. So we always see these moments, it's something really important to think about. What is your union avoidance strategy, right? When people are afraid of losing their jobs, unions can often get a little footprint into your workplace and start to gather support for a union. So the more you deal with these ideas in your work environment, that you have a plan, that you know that there is a risk of unionization when technology could replace some of these employees, you really need to think about your unionization plan and how to make sure that you're putting in the right plan to stop unionization. Thank you. I think over to you, Stéphane.
Yes, next slide, please. So although Alix kind of started talking about it at the beginning of the presentation, I thought I would use the now famous at least, Southern New York case that she mentioned at the beginning, because I think it kind of shows you first how scary it could be, but it can also show you why I was saying, are you really sure I'm not an AI-generated person? So essentially in this very interesting case that was decided in June 2023, the reason why I have so many information is I was doubting if that was even a real decision. So I made some additional research and went to see the decision itself. So essentially, a federal judge tossed a lawsuit and issued a $5,000 fine to two lawyers and their law firm after they used ChatGPT to prepare court filings and arguments that cited 6 fake cases invented by ChatGPT. And you'll see it's not just a question of inventing cases. They really had they really cited in the arguments that ChatGPT cited in the arguments non-existent judicial opinions, fake quotes and citations of decision where the judge was identified, and there were even fake parties to these cases. Obviously, it went even further because what happened actually is once they filed the arguments, the other party kind of tried to find these decisions to have more information on it and couldn't find them. So they just basically wrote, listen, I don't know where you took these decisions, but we can't find them. They don't seem to exist. But the lawyers being so convinced of their thing, they continued to argue that these were real decisions until finally, obviously, the judge saw through it and basically, obviously got really mad. So in other words, and in this particular case, by the way, aside from the $5,000 fine, the lawyers were forced or ordered to send letters to the judges in question, apologizing for citing fake quotes that were actually, according to the court, bogus statements made apparently by judges, but obviously that never happened, as well as letters to the parties who were actually involved in these fake cases as having done something, worthy of a lawsuit. So that's why I was saying, you look into this and you kind of wonder, is that real? And how can I exactly verify if that's actually the case? So let's come back to, we're talking about tort law here, but to understand that the same rules would apply in civil law in Quebec. So it's not going to be based on the same principles, but the end result is basically the same. So the difficulty is determining if the information obtained came from reliable sources. So what example could we find as an example if we're going back to an HR model? So for example, you could ask a ChatGPT or another type of AI to prepare a job posting or to prepare any kind of statements. And so you think that it's been generated by AI, but what if basically AI took it from another source that was actually a job posting from another company or a statement made by someone else outside of the workplace? How would you know where this is coming from? Are you going to basically at every time put everything on the internet and try to see if this is actually coming from the right sources? So obviously that's certainly something that you take into account. I was mentioning earlier on the automation bias that obviously comes into this. If ChatGPT said it, it must be real cases. Well, apparently not. Other issues that you might have to think about is, what if the content that is actually being used by generative AI actually protected, whether under copyrights or otherwise? How would you know if this information is actually you're able or you're allowed to use it? We're talking about, it could even be like text, obviously, because sometimes, as you know, you could have AI basically generating a statement which would basically take whole sentences coming from protected text, and maybe you wouldn't know about it because it's not in quotation marks and there's no reference to it. So that's a portion related to text, but it could also be images. So as an example, I was thinking, how cool would that be to ask AI to basically generate promotional materials, maybe a brochure or marketing thing, but where are the images coming from? Are they using images found on the internet that might be protected, but that were on the internet because someone else was already putting it there without rights? So that's also part of the reality. And you might think, okay, but is this really happening? Well, actually, there are already class actions and lawsuits that have been filed, as I will mention later on. Alix already mentioned in another portion of her presentation the risk of using AI to analyze CVs and maybe resulting in some form of discrimination. Again, that could lead to lawsuit and potential liability. It could also be involuntary. As Alix was mentioning, AI is based basically on whatever data you feed it. So if it's based on data collected from the last century that was basically showed discrimination patterns, you might just be reproducing it, and as a result, it could lead to lawsuits or human rights claims. This is why we talk about the need to provide goalposts for employees. So in other words, to provide some mechanism to make sure that the organization is protected, or at least is as protected as it could be. It could include audit mechanism as an example. I'm going to talk more about that, so I won't go into it further at this point. And it also includes AI policies, procedures, and training, as we will see. Next slide. Another potential liability source is obviously confidential leaks. This is why, actually, when ChatGPT came out, many organizations actually adopted policies preventing or prohibiting employees from using ChatGPT in the context of their work until they had a better understanding of what it entails, because ultimately it's the organization that may be liable if it's used inappropriately and it leads to leaks. Nowadays, actually, there's been important progress being made regarding that. There's even some AI that doesn't work on a cloud basis and it doesn't use the internet. It could be used just on your own information, but maybe your own information contains some aspects that are protected or that are confidential, and maybe that shouldn't be in there. A lot of the AI software now includes settings that prevent confidential leaks, but do employees know that they exist? Do they know how to use it? And basically, can your organization rely on them to activate it? Because at the end of the day, if they fail to do so, and there's a confidential leak, there's a very high likelihood that the organization will be liable for all of this. And you might see on the image, actually, that you have on the screen, it refers to, specifically to a situation where Samsung, an employee of Samsung, leaked confidential information to OpenAI via ChatGPT using the tool. Took 20 days, and it basically went in the news. So obviously not the best way to make yourself popular. Next slide. Another question that I found both interesting and extremely difficult to understand was the whole aspect of IP, intellectual property. So the question basically is, who owns the work? First, there's an aspect contractually. What do the terms of service say? What about the licenses? And this is just between your organization and the AI tool. For those who have started using AI in the workplace, have you looked into this? Do you know the answer to these questions in accordance with just your contract that you signed? It's certainly a good thing to conduct some form of due diligence to make sure it's clarified in the contract or license. Next slide. But even assuming that it's clear in the contract, what about just copyright law? Under Canadian copyright law, the author of a work is generally the person who creates it. However, when it comes to generative AI, who created it? Is it the generative AI? Is it the person who basically created the data on which generative AI based itself to produce the result? Is this the person basically who asked generative AI to provide it? Because obviously the work is created by an algorithm and not a human. In Canada, while there's no specific law that addresses generative AI and copyright infringements, so we're to a certain extent clear on that part. The Copyright Act, however, provides remedies for copyright infringement, and could lead to injunctions, damages, and account of profits. And this could include not just things that are clearly copied, but it also includes, for example, we saw it in one of the lawsuits, the AI reproducing the particular style of an artist in the context of the production of a response. Obviously, I'm sure you would like me to end this section with an answer to all of these questions, but unfortunately, I will not be able to. It's clearly a gray area, which means risky, which means basically an answer that pretty much all my clients hate. We'll see what happens. At the present time, I'm not exactly sure how it will end. But basically, I think this should just serve as a reminder that we need to be extra careful. I don't think we can avoid using AI because all of your competitors will be using it sooner or later. So in other words, just saying, I'm not going to get into this, I don't think is the right answer. But it just means that we'll need to be very well prepared in case there's issues that arise. I mentioned earlier on lawsuits that are currently pending. So far, we're kind of lucky because all of the lawsuits, at least that I found during the preparation for this presentation, were against the companies who basically created the AI. But I can give you an example. Getty Images is actually suing Stability AI, an AI company, for using 12 million copyrighted images without permission to train its AI. There's also another lawsuit, a class action lawsuit actually, that is being brought by artists alleging infringement of their copyrights by the generative AI, which, as I mentioned earlier on, can copy the particular style of certain artists. And this is against Stability AI, Deviant Art, and Midjourney. There's also an action against Microsoft, GitHub, and OpenAI regarding the use of open source code. So it gives you an idea that it's already ongoing. So the good thing is it's probably going to provide an answer sooner rather than later on some of the limits of all of this. But I'm quite sure your organization would prefer not to be the one making the case law. So next slide. I think it's your turn, actually, Alix.
To follow on with what Stéphane has said, we're in a bare legal landscape. We do anticipate, obviously, statutory reforms coming over the next year. And if we move to the next slide, you can see that we have the Canadian Digital Charter, which is made up of the Consumer Privacy Protection Act, the Personal Information and Data Protection Tribunal Act, and the Artificial Intelligence and Data Act. And those are the three acts that the Canadian government is looking at to really deal and regulate digital use in Canada. We're starting to see, obviously, in the European Union, they've had a commission that's been set up, and there's an AI office to enforce the new rules on AI systems in the European Commission, and that's going to be voted on in April. The United States is obviously in the midst of this too. They have an executive order, and they are obviously looking at security and safety issues with AI. And we again see in the United Kingdom, they're also going to be publishing a new paper in April. So we expect to see that there's going to be lots of changes in the laws and regulations in 2024. And obviously that will continue to go after, especially as we see some of these cases work their way through the legal system. And then just briefly on the next slide, we just wanted to mention sort of where we are with the Artificial Intelligence and Data Act, ADA, which is Bill C-27. We've passed in the second reading, and that is also going to the Standing Committee in April. And really, the focus here was to aim at high impact AI systems. And what they mean, by high impact AI systems is really around these employment related determinations such as hiring and remuneration and termination. And this would include recruitment systems, screening systems that affect access to services or employment, because those could obviously exacerbate historical biases. Biometric systems used for identification and inference. This can obviously track individuals' behavior and mental state. And so this allows individuals or groups' behavior to be inferred. And so there's a risk of inadvertent bias and psychological harm that can arise from some of the use of these systems. And then obviously we're looking at social media and health and safety critical systems, and those are all considered high impact AI systems that this act is really focusing on. I would say shortly, this is really about the producers of AI. This is not really about the users of AI. And so we expect to have more clarity from the government as they move forward to the Standing Committee. Next slide.
Next slide. So how to deal with AI? Obviously by being extremely proactive. This includes obviously employee training and policies. I'm going to talk more about policies in the next slide, so I'll focus now on training. The idea of training, let's be clear, is not just to tell employees how they can use AI, but also inform them through training of the risk involved in using AI and what they should be careful with. The necessity, for example, to confirm the information that is being generated. Talk about, as an example, potential issues of discrimination, the risk involved with negligence, confidentiality, the issues surrounding IP, all the things we mentioned earlier on. It also includes being proactive in risk analysis and management. Right from the start, we highly recommend some kind of a multidisciplinary team that could include obviously HR and AI specialists, but also probably many people more in the workplace, because in order to make the AI efficient and to kind of reduce the risk, you probably need to adapt it to your own reality. And this is going to be extremely important. That way you can identify potential flaws and perhaps remedy it immediately. You must also supervise and document the use of AI within the company. It's not only a good practice just so you're able to know, what are your potential flaws, but also if something ever happens, at least you've documented it, and we know, that this is coming. And by documenting it, it kind of forces you to take it into consideration and to wonder, are there risks related to that, and what can I do to remove it? There's also review of employment contracts and AI solution supplier contracts. Employment contracts we've already talked about. Are there needs to modify elements in this to take into account the potential impact of AI in the future and in the present? And when it comes to AI solution supplier contracts, we're talking more about what if your suppliers are allowed to use your data? Are you sure you're well protected contractually from a confidentiality, privacy, and also IP standpoint? Some of you may be familiar, maybe in various organizations, with what we call a risk analysis framework. So in most boards, as an example, will have that type of exercise that is being conducted that allows you to really understand and kind of start thinking about it in the first place, that, where are the risks? what can we do to alleviate this risk, and also set up a contingency plan in case something goes bad. You must also ensure that modifications or termination of position are not discriminatory. Be very careful with potentially ageism in the workplace. Even in some discussions that I've been party to recently, I was hearing people saying, "Oh, perhaps we should hire younger employees because they will probably know more about AI." Exactly the type of thing you should not be hearing, and that you need to be careful. It's not because they might have not lived with it that they cannot be trained to adapt to it. And so obviously that's something to be careful with. Next slide. When it comes to policies, and I'm not going to go through all of this, I'm just going to make a few statements on this. So obviously, this is what you should include. So purpose and scope. Understand that a policy is advisable whether you're providing Gen I tools to your employees or not. If you're providing Gen I tools, obviously, you'll want to explain the risk involved and kind of the conduct you expect your employees to do. But even if you're not providing it, you should have a statement somehow of, as an example, we don't allow you to use ChatGPT, or we allow you to use it, but only under these circumstances, and what type of information could be entered. It should include ethical principles guiding the use of AI. As an example, we talked a lot about potential discrimination. This could be a good way to talk about it in a policy. If there's ever a lawsuit that alleges that we did something wrong, at least we have a statement that talks about that. It should also explain, as an example, the importance of not relying on false information or misleading material, and of ensuring, obviously, the protection of copyrighted material. Then there's confidentiality protection, which we've talked about a lot, but obviously that would be an important section, just addressing what employees can put in the prompt when using AI. At the minimum, it should prohibit your employees from entering any kind of private or personal information into any Gen I platform. You will also want to make sure that your company's most important data, could be trade secret, private information, IP of your employees and other parties, confidential data and sensitive matters, are kept far away from Gen I, just to make sure there's no trouble with this. The use of AI for HR. So again, I think we've talked about it a lot. Transparency is another key aspect in a lot of organizations. When should employees disclose that they've used AI? And how? Is it going to be in a footnote or otherwise? This can also help kind of address potential future problems by having this information. So authorization process, caution on accuracy, I've already mentioned. Malicious use, deep fakes. This is getting pretty incredible. Some of you might have seen that they can even do it with video conference, where basically your boss is talking to you. You have the image, the voice, and your boss is asking you to send a check of $100,000 to this account or this account. It's getting pretty crazy, and obviously this is certainly another way to inform your employees of the risk. And finally, as with any kind of good policy, provide some for consequences for violations, and pretty clear language, as an example, that this could lead to immediate termination and even possibly legal action. So that's what I had at this point. And next slide, maybe. I'll try to see if we have time for some questions. I will ask you, Alix, one of the questions, just because I want to put you on the spot. But I have to tell you, it's kind of pretty technical, so we might not be the best person to answer that. But I just thought it'd be funny to end with something like that. So Alix, what if the employer uses Dropbox for business or something? Is there a software that can determine if the employee is transferring it to a non-work Dropbox or other service?
Well, I don't know Dropbox specifically, but I would hazard a guess that yes, in all likelihood, our current IT systems. I just had a case where an employee downloaded and sent to her personal email all her stuff, and we could obviously track that. So I think whenever you're downloading materials from your work environment, it can be tracked. And so I would expect that you would be able to do that, but someone needs to speak to Dropbox.
Yeah. The next question, I'll take it because I found it easier. That's why I kept it for me. So the question was, can you track if the employee emails themselves a document or uploads it to a non-work network? As someone who has done actually quite a few cases in recent years, I can tell you, yes, you can. There's basically nothing a good IT firm cannot find on your computer. And that's most of the cases, for example, of a violation of duty of loyalty. I'm using the Quebec terms, obviously, or kind of dishonest competition as an example, come exactly from that. The employee announcing his resignation and basically a few hours before sent itself several tons of document and emails. Yes, we can always find it. And even if you empty your deleted message, it doesn't work. So for sure, that's something.
Never deleted.
So listen, that's all I had in the questions. I think at this point I'll just move on to thanking you all for being here. I'll leave you, Alix, to say the last word, but thank you all for being here. I hope it was fun for you to listen to us during this presentation. Have you learned a lot as we did actually in preparing this training for you? So, Alix, the last word.
Thanks, Stéphane. Everyone, thank you again for joining us. We're always open to feedback, so please send us your feedback. Make sure you look at the other PDAC events that we're putting on. I'm sure there's going to be lots of other interesting. If you use our new AI system here where you can just take a picture and complete our survey, we'd really appreciate it. Always feedback helps us develop better programming for the future. And thank you again for joining us today.